Over the past 2 weeks, we've been looking at ways to develop our own spiritual resilience as we enter into public life and community life. And we looked at ways to prepare us through being self-aware, and we've looked at the moral courage it takes to step out and engage. And the next practice that we're going to look at this week builds off of these two, and that's developing a pure motivation. This step requires a deeper level of self-awareness and a higher degree of spiritual development. So I'm sure you've heard people ask, like, what's the biggest difference in our spiritual tradition versus, say, traditional Christianity? And pretty often we say something like this, they teach that it's what you say that leads to salvation, and we teach it's what you do. Or you can sum it up in a phrase: the only way to measure your love of God is how you love your neighbor. And we also say all faith paths are good if you're leading a life of love. So those are some of the differences. And in many traditional church and a lot of traditional Christianity, it's been more about saying the right phrase or believing in the right creed. And if you get that right, simply saying, I believe in Jesus Christ, for example, is enough of a testimony to get a person saved. And I don't want to cartoon that perspective, because I think that the folks who believe that would say that if you're saved, you'll go on to do good things, and we'll know that by the fruits of your life. So probably not all that different, but there is a difference between what you say and what you do. And a lot of religion, unfortunately, gets trapped in what you say and not so much in what you do. We can say that actions speak louder than words, but words are a fine place to start, but there has to be some activity in our life that shows that we're changing and growing. Can't just be something that we have in our head. So you may have heard these phrases, I can't hear what you're saying because I'm too busy watching what you do, or the phrase from St. Francis of Assisi, who said, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. So the point is really, in spiritual growth, it's really what you do, not what you say. And when we see someone, particularly a religious person, a religious leader in particular, who is not loving, who is unkind, it gives Christianity a bad name, and we would see that person as a hypocrite. And in the lesson from John today, he sums it up pretty clearly. If anyone says, I love God, but keeps on hating his brother, he is a liar, for he doesn't love his brother who is right there in front of him. How can he love God whom he's never seen? And God himself has said that we must love not only God, but our brother too. And that's from 1 John. And it wasn't one of the readings today, but it's an additional way of saying the same thing, that you can't say you love your neighbor and, you can't say you love God and hate your neighbor. So those are basic principles. I think we all pretty much get that. To grow spiritually, we have to love others. That's our life challenge. And so, end of sermon, very, very short sermon, right? We have to have action. But this week, the answer is not so fast. I wish the sermon could be just that short, but we're going to have to go a little deeper. Once we've done that, right, we've said the right words, we're actively trying to be better people, our actions are reflecting it, there's still more. And that is that we are taught that we have to deeply examine the motivations of our actions to grow spiritually. In other words, doing good things is not enough. We must do good things, and we have to do it with the right intentions. And it turns out that our intentions are maybe even more important than our actions. So in the gospel lesson today, Jesus describes people who are passing on to the next life, and they're arguing, and they're saying, they're trying to get into heaven, and they're saying, I did all these great things. I did them, and I spoke about my love of God. And Jesus responds that there will be a lot of people who will say they spoke out in God's name and actually did good actions, but they're not welcome into heaven, which is a little frightening. And the reason is because their intentions were selfish. Their motivations were wrong. So when we do good things in the world for selfish motivations, it undermines the good work. In 1 Corinthians 13, the Apostle Paul sums this up nicely when he says, if I give all my money to the poor and I suffer publicly for my faith, I'm doing it, and I'm doing it for the wrong reasons, with no love of others, then it's worthless. So deep spiritual growth looks at motivations, and our motivations have to be about loving others, not just about ourselves. And we're all geared naturally to look after our own self-interest, because if we don't, who will? But it is required in our faith to look deeper. So you could sum it up this way. Words are important, but they're not enough. It's not enough just to say it's what you do. Actions are important, but not enough. It's not just what you do, it's why you do it. This is hard work. It requires us to keep asking ourselves, why? Why am I doing what I do? Why am I doing this? In my experience, the good news is that we can get better at coming from pure intentions and motivations when we work and reflect on it. But the bad news is our intentions and motivations will never be completely pure. There will always be a mix. And I think that part of the human experience of growth is trying to make that mix a little bit more pure and a little less selfish, but it will always be a mix. So we have to keep asking, why do I do what do I do? Why do I do what I do? I look at this mix of motivations, something like this. So I've been told to eat more fruit, more vegetables, and less meat. Maybe you have too. I'm not particularly crazy about it, but I am trying. And so this last week, I had for breakfast blueberries, which I'm told are really superfoods, and strawberries for breakfast. Yay, way to go, Rich. But to make it more appetizing, I added in some peanut butter and I mixed in some granola. And by the time I was done, my breakfast looked more like a dessert. I added a lot of salt, I added a lot of sugar. But for me, I was moving in the right direction. I did get the fruit that I've been missing. I play similar tricks with salad and meat as well. The point is, if I can't do the purest, I can move in that direction. Now, one day I will probably eat a healthier diet if I keep working in this direction. So it's step by step. It's a mixture of motivations. And that's how we need to operate in our daily life. In the economic system of the world that we live in, it's hard to do anything really without also thinking about, do I get paid? Will there be financial remuneration? As we all would like to know, it would be great if I could go to the grocery store and check out at the end and say, by the way, I'm a pastor. So, and they would just wave me through. It doesn't work that way. We live in a world where there are financial needs. So we'll always have that on our mind. But there is a spectrum and there is a mix, and it's complicated. I think some people that I've worked with, particularly in my coaching practice, when I ask, like, why are you at that job doing that? They'll be blunt. I'm just doing it for the money. It's really profitable. And they don't necessarily like it, but it's profitable and it gives them the money to give them freedom to what they want to do. And then the other end of the spectrum, I've met people who never worry about money, but they're often in need themselves, asking for help because they're just going around doing good things and not worried about finances. Somewhere in the middle is choosing things that are purposeful and can also pay the bills. And that's a tension in our life, is finding that mixture of what's my true intention? Why am I really doing it? Why am I really working with this person, talking to this person, engaging? And try to make your motivations as pure as possible. One sign you do see about certain people is there's an expression: watch people how they treat taxi cab drivers and waiters, because there's a power dynamic. And if they are unkind to them, look out. Treating people who cannot benefit us and treating them really well is a way we can move in that direction of a pure intention. It's not transactional. Two areas in our public life today that may look really bad, when we look at how they're evolving, there might be some good news underneath. So the two areas I'm talking about that look pretty bad is faith in church and church growth and spiritual growth is a first good example. 80 years ago today, on a Sunday, everybody in a town in the United States would go to some church somewhere. And churches were booming, they were building new ones. Everybody went. And so it would look like, wow, those were the good old days. People were spiritual, they went to church. Now we live in times when nobody wants to go to church, churches are failing, and nobody's particularly interested in spiritual life. And so it's a terrible time. But when we look at why, we ask the why question, the motivation question. A lot of times people went to church in those days because everybody was doing it. You would be judged if you didn't. It was expected. It would look bad if you didn't go. So people, maybe they were engaged in church or spiritual life, but they were doing it not from the best motivations. They were worried what others thought. Today, people like yourselves who are attending church and looking to grow spiritually are lower in numbers, dramatically so. But when you engage with people, their motivations are pure. There's a million options they can do, and they choose to develop their inner life. And so the motivations are pure, which actually makes for a more healthy spiritual life. Marriage is another example. 80 years ago today, people didn't get divorced. They couldn't be single. Women couldn't live alone. And we said, oh, well, look at how great things were. Everybody was married, and it was a very, traditional society. But the reality is, when we look again under the surface, many women at that time couldn't live a single life, and they couldn't get jobs, and they couldn't be independent. And their sole security was being aligned to a man. And many lived in abusive relationships, right? But they had nowhere to go. So many of those marriages were loveless, but they looked good in public. They checked the box. So today, with our complexity, we might have a higher divorce rate. We might have more single people finding new ways to live fulfilling life outside of those traditional norms. And when you talk to them, the life that they're leading is more from a pure motivation. There's not necessarily the public perception that you have to do it. And so people are free to be more honest about those relationships. So those are two areas, I think, that when you look on the surface, it might look things are getting worse, but actually when you look deeper, the motivations might be more pure. The final area I want to talk about concerning motivations is something that we want to do more of at the church, and that is engaging in civil dialogue. And what we've seen in the studies is that people who come to dialogue very often are not coming to listen. Their deep motivation is not understanding, it's winning. They believe they're right, and they get to the dialogue, and all they want to do is persuade the other side. They want to convert them to the truth. And the other side generally picks up that vibe, and the dialogue doesn't go all that well. And then people say, well, we tried, I tried to talk to them, but they're idiots. I give up. And the reality is their motivation wasn't to hear or listen or understand. Their motivation was to win over, and it didn't work. And that's a real issue that we find in the bridge building space, and something we need to be aware of. We need to check our emotions when we're engaging in dialogue with people. Can we shift from, I need to be right, I need to win, this is about my side, and can we shift to, I'm curious why they believe what they believe. I'm compassionate to why they believe what they believe. When we shift our motivations, we can shift the entire discussion. So there's no shortcut here to this higher level of growth, which is examining our motivations. Like moral courage, it requires us to keep trying, keep acting. It's not something we can do in our heads. We keep trying, we keep asking why, and keep looking inside. And once we answer those questions as honestly as we can move on to seeking small steps to move in the right direction for all of our motivations, so they will be pure in the eyes of God. Amen.